Joining us to go over all of this, former FBI Assistant Special Agent in Charge Michael Feinberg, former U.S. Attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Joyce Vance, Lisa Rubin, Chris O'Leary, David Graham, Brandy Zadrozny, Steve Patterson, and Ken Dilanian are all still here. Ken, we've been talking about the profile. You've got a little reporting on a pair of folks who say they do think they have a pattern and a profile to act off of.
They wouldn't call it a profile, Katie. I think Chris is exactly right. No two people are quite the same in this respect, but it's called the Violence Project, and they put together a database of every mass shooting going back decades. And what they found are some commonalities, some things that surface again and again that are warning signs. The problem is, and I've talked to these people extensively and I've done reporting on it, these warning signs surface among many, many people who don't end up committing mass shootings. And so this is not an exact science here. But they talk about, they often see that a future mass shooter or future perpetrator of an act of violence like this has come into some kind of personal crisis, has been the victim of some kind of past trauma in their life, expresses suicidality, the intent to commit suicide, has had some kind of mental health history, often expresses a fascination with past attacks. And again, many of these traits have not been exhibited, at least according to the public evidence, by this person in this case, which is what's so perplexing about this. This person has not, we don't have information that suggests that Tyler Robinson fits this category. But, and the other thing they would tell you is that there's this misnomer that people have a psychotic break and go and do something like this. Very often it's a long, slow decline into alienation, into anger. It's something they think about for a very long time. And they often have what's called leakage, where they talk to other people about their potential plans. And again, no evidence of that in this case whatsoever. So that's what makes this case so perplexing. There is a set of characteristics, and so far, Tyler Robinson doesn't seem to meet very many of them. Kate. Characteristics,
a better way to describe it than profile. Michael Feinberg, I'd love to have you weigh in on this.
Yeah, I think a lot of what Ken said is true. I'm always a little wary of extrapolating specific characteristics, even from a really well-done study. But to sort of reach back to what individuals were saying about nihilism earlier, this is very much on the rise. When I left the FBI, the #1 domestic priority threat that we were looking at was the 764 group. And we're really seeing a shift.
I'm just sorry to interrupt you. Can you, I know Chris has mentioned it a couple times, just explain who the 764 group is?
Of course. The 764 group is a decentralized online community based on a lot of occult influences and a sort of sense of performative nihilism. And it almost operates as a ideological Ponzi scheme where instead of getting people in sort of the form of a chain letter to send money or something along those lines, they try and get individuals to self-harm or harm animals or commit other violent acts. And then once they've done so, if they're still around, those individuals in turn proselytize the same mission. It's honestly one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in my entire career in both law enforcement and as a former prosecutor. And it really serves as a canary in the coal mine that the sort of performative violent nihilism is something that's very much on the rise with the younger generations in a way that we haven't had to reckon with as a country before.
So, David, that is scary. And it is a brave new world, if you will. Everybody's online. Parents are online. Kids are online. Parents can't get offline. It's hard for parents to tell their kids to get offline. It feels like we are in a very vicious and dangerous cycle.
And it feels like they're blending. I mean, looking at the text messages included in this charging document, you see a sense almost that he can't tell reality apart from what's online.
Yeah.
So he's more concerned with his father missing the weapon than the life of this person he took. He is concerned about the memes. He's like doing it for the laughs of seeing these things on Fox News. So there seems to be like almost a flippancy that represents this disconnection from reality, I think.
The flattening out of people online. You take a real human person who has many different characteristics, who has a family, who is a three-dimensional person, and you see snippets of them, and they become not a person, but a character. You know, we talk about how everyone thinks that they're the main character in a movie, and everyone else is, what are they, you know, a non...
NPC.
An NPC, non-player...
Non-player character.
Non-player character. Gosh, Brandy, I mean, you report on the online world. Where do people find success pulling themselves out of it?
You know, I don't know. I think it's only getting worse. And I can't help but notice this moment that we're in post Charlie Kirk's murder is that it seems to be getting so much worse. Now we have these targeted campaigns targeting anyone who's ever said anything, or someone suggests they might be saying anything, or wants to misconstrue that they've said something about Charlie Kirk's death in a way that doesn't grieve him properly. There's a website that says they have 60,000 names and employers of people. Vice President J.D. Vance just suggested that if you hear someone talking bad about Charlie Kirk, that you call their employer. I mean, we are turning into these people that not only flatten each other online, but then go and do it in real life. And it's really, really upsetting. And I will say one more thing. I think what we've just learned here really disputes some of what we've heard over the last 2 days from the president, from the vice president who guest hosted Charlie Kirk's podcast yesterday, that the killer of Charlie Kirk worked somehow in some vast left-wing conspiracy to cause or to operate or to oversee Charlie Kirk's murder. It does not seem like that at all. We have no evidence for that. I just think that's super important to point out.
Chris?
Yes, that's true. There have been periods in the United States where violence from the left was the predominant, movement. Late '60s, early '70s. But even going back, the original political violence in the United States, putting the KKK aside, coming out of the Civil War, but the anarchist movement, and I mean that really you had, President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. Teddy Roosevelt, when he was running for re-election, was shot by an anarchist, still gave a speech, kind of tough, in Pittsburgh. Massive bombing on Wall Street.
Never caught those people, by the way.
Correct. But when we get out of the 1970s and early 80s, we see the militia movement on the rise, and the far right and the neo-Nazi movement, which all culminates in Oklahoma City. That has reemerged with accelerationists who are truly, let me just explain to you what they are. They're trying to bring the downfall of our society so the white cream can rise to the top of the coffee. And that really is Charles Manson's teaching. So
How much of this is fueled by bots online? Do we have an idea? Or is it real people?
It's yes, surely there is some bot activity around some of this stuff, but who cares? I mean, the fact that there's so much authentic content being spread, including by the world's richest man, the president of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. It's almost not helpful to even bring it in the conversation.
I do want to focus on the family here and the roommate, because they clearly loved the suspect. He was a son. And he was a romantic partner to the roommate, and you could see even in the exchanges described with the family and the exchange that they posted between the roommate and Robinson, there was affection there, but that did not outweigh their desire for him to be held accountable. I mean, the need obviously for him to be held accountable. They loved him, but they turned him in.
Yeah, and first of all, I want to acknowledge that the greatest loss here obviously was suffered by Charlie Kirk's family, his widow, and his children.
Absolutely.
When we talk about, though, the family of Tyler Robinson and his partner, you can see how wrenching this must have been for his parents and his roommate in their communications here. And, Katie, I'm asked a lot on our shows about the death of law. Is this where law ends? Are we in a constitutional crisis? Where does the rule of law end? There is something affirming about the fact that 3 separate people here who either knew or had reasons to suspect that someone they loved was the perpetrator of this crime came together to ensure that the person could be held accountable, because Tyler Robinson, according to this charging document, was expressing suicidality. And yet his parents and a family friend convinced him not only to not take his own life, but to come to the house, discuss with them, and manage to convince him to go to the Washington County Sheriff's Office to surrender. Same thing with the roommate. You know, the roommate incredulously saying in this text exchange, after discovering a note that Tyler Robinson told the roommate to look for under his keyboard, he reads the note and he says, "You weren't the one who did it, right?" And Robinson says, "I am. I'm sorry." And then further admits to his motive, and then talks about, "If I'm able to grab my rifle unseen, I will have left no evidence." That itself is another admission. Now, under Utah law, a confession is not enough to find somebody guilty of a crime. You have to have corroborating evidence. But throughout this, there are multiple confessions and or admissions, whether online or in person, that I will expect prosecutors to trot out at trial. And guess who some of their witnesses are going to have to be? Mr. and Mrs. Robinson and maybe the roommate. And these people have put themselves in harm's way to do the right thing by the law. And in that respect, and only in that respect, do I find some affirmation about the survival of law in our country.
It was an absolutely explosive day of testimony on Capitol Hill today. Going into today's Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, FBI Director Kash Patel faced rare intra-MAGA criticism from right-wing activist Chris Rufo, as well as a lawsuit filed last week from 3 career FBI agents with spectacular and sterling reputations. Add 2 agents who are speaking out to the New York Times today for the first time about how politics has seeped into every Patel calculation and the botched communications around the manhunt for Charlie Kirk's killer, and you have a tinderbox of tension from all sides for one Kash Patel. One of the most supremely important lines of questioning today came from Democrats in their search for answers and accountability, and it had to do with FBI personnel, specifically whether or not any of them were fired for political purposes. Here's Kash Patel's exchange with California Senator Adam Schiff.
Are you testifying today that you never terminated anyone at the FBI, in whole or in part, because of a prior case assignment?
No one at the FBI is terminated for case assignments alone.
Well, I'm asking about you, Mr. Patel. Did you, in whole or in part, terminate anyone at the FBI because they worked on the Trump investigation or because they worked on January 6th?
No one at the FBI has been terminated for case assignments alone.
Okay, you're saying alone. Does that mean they were terminated in part because they were assigned to a January 6th case or assigned to the Mar-a-Lago case? You're being very precise here, Mr. Patel. You're saying alone. That means they were fired in part because they were assigned those cases. Is that your testimony?
Absolutely not. But if you want to keep putting words in my mouth,
then let me
ahead.
ask you, let's strip away the word alone. Did you terminate or participate in any discipline of any FBI employee in whole or in part because of their work on an investigation of Donald Trump or January 6th? Yes or no?
Any terminations at the FBI by employees?
No, I'm asking you a very specific question.
And I'm going to answer the question, but you don't like the answer because it's the truth and it guts
want
your
an answer to my
narrative.
question. I don't want an answer to someone else's question.
That's about as well as it went for Kash Patel. That testimony from the director, though, the FBI, that denial, stands in direct contrast and opposition, let's call it Earth 2 testimony, to what former FBI officials are alleging in an incredibly detailed 67-page federal lawsuit. Washington Post pulled this from their suit, quote, Patel then stated that his own job depended on the removal of the agents who worked on the cases against the president, regardless of whether the agents chose to work on those cases or not, end quote. It was one of, but certainly not the only, vital avenue that was explored today by the Senate Judiciary Committee. Later in the broadcast, we'll show you where Patel's answers on Jeffrey Epstein, for instance, ignited passions among lawmakers and the FBI alike. But first, to better acquaint yourself with the tone and tenor of today's hearing, consider this exchange as well between Kash Patel and Senator Cory Booker.
I don't think you're fit to hand the Bureau, but here's the thing, Mr. Patel. I think you're not going to be around long. I think this might be your last oversight hearing. Because as much as you supplicate yourself to the will of Donald Trump and not the Constitution of the United States of America, Donald Trump has shown us in his first term and in this term, he is not loyal to people like you. He will cut you loose. This may be the last time I have a hearing with you because I don't think you're long for your job. But I'm going to tell you this. I pray for you. I pray for you that you can step up and defend your oath, defend the Constitution, and do a much better job of defending this country.
Yes, sir. That rant of false information does not bring this country together. If you want to work on bringing this country, it's my time, not yours.
My God.
If you want to talk about
dividing this country,
it is
I follow you on your social media posts that tears this country apart.
To address your falsehoods.
Oh, you can try all you want
in this country.
to not take responsibility for what you have said. Sir, you're making a mockery of this committee. Sir, you don't tell me my time is over.
Only Kash Patel can make one miss Matt Gaetz. Glenn Thrush is bylined on the Times reporting about the fired FBI agents. I should point out, Glenn, though, this reporting today is extraordinary. Everybody should read it. These are 2 additional agents from the 3 agents who filed the lawsuit last week. Tell us their stories.
So these are actually the 2 agents that we believe played a role in Brian Driscoll and Jensen, the head of the Washington field office, getting fired, because these are the 2 agents that they stood up for with Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, who also wanted them fired. So these are 2 guys, both of them decorated combat veterans. Jensen, who is the pilot, Chris Meyer, who is the Kash Patel's pilot until last month, decorated combat pilot through 350 hours in Afghanistan on 3 different types of aircraft. And then you have Walter Giardina, who did 2 tours in Iraq, was in an intelligence unit that debriefed Taliban leaders, 20-year, 19-career year in the Bureau, who are not at the moment credibly accused of anything other than working on the Jack Smith investigations. In fact, Meyer was falsely accused by a MAGA influencer of going through Melania Trump's underwear drawer during the Mar-a-Lago search, and the guy was on vacation at the time and was not assigned to it. This is the level of kind of discourse we're dealing with here. Both of these guys, and I got to tell you, if you've ever, I'm sure you've spoken to them, Nicole, FBI agents do not, particularly field agents, not supervisors, are not fond of talking to the press, even under duress. So it was a big deal for them to tell us, tell my colleague Alan Foyer and I exactly how difficult this was on them and how unfair that they felt it was. But Walt Giardina in particular had an extraordinary story. His wife had stage 4 adrenal cancer. She was 49 years old. She had an adverse reaction to chemotherapy that caused her to pace back and forth endlessly. He was spending his days and nights trying to calm her down and comforting her while he was learning that his job was in danger, while he was trying to get the FBI brass to do a due process investigation. My story doesn't address the issue as to whether or not any of the allegations against them are true or false. They claim fairly credibly that they're false. All these 2 guys wanted was due process, a formal investigation before they were fired. And they hadn't gotten that. And Patel was told about Walter's wife's physical problems. Jensen begged him, and Patel not only ignored that summons, but then fired Jensen to boot.
What did they want? Did they want to stay at the FBI?
Yes, I think this would have been the intention. I think Chris Meyer was perfectly happy flying around on these airplanes. He participated in prisoner transfers overseas. This is the work that these guys were trained for. You know, these were not folks who were aspiring in the political arena or wanted to make a lot of money or wanted to even trade in these jobs for more lucrative private sector gigs. They wanted to spend their entire career in the Bureau. And Walter Giardina was a midshipman. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1999. He commanded 100 troops in the first Gulf War and was involved in several firefights. And he saw his FBI service, he told me, as an extension of the government service he undertook when he was a midshipman. So these are, these are two individuals who, generally speaking, are the kinds of people that you want in these jobs. Unfortunately for Walter Giardina, he worked on the original Mueller investigation, though he didn't deal with any of the Russia connections. He worked on the Jack Smith January 6th investigation. And perhaps most unluckily of all, he was assigned to arrest Trump aide Peter Navarro on contempt of Congress charges at Reagan Airport in 2023, which Navarro has publicly called him out for. So again, my story doesn't do a fulsome investigation of whether of their behavior. Chuck Grassley claims he's got two whistleblowers that say negative things about Giardina, but both of these gentlemen simply wanted a fair hearing, and now they are appealing to a special board in the federal government. And the only reason why they're going to get an investigation in due process, which might actually result in Bongino and Patel being called to testify, is because they were veterans. There's a special provision in the law that allows FBI agents who are veterans to have a due process, whereas if they had not been veterans, they could be fired without a cause.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The Trump administration is announcing their intention, loud and clear, that they want to use every tool of the state at their disposal to suppress domestic political dissent. The president himself said as much today, bullying reporters and telling one, maybe we'll come after you, too.
What do you make Pam Bondi saying she's going to go after hate speech? Is that, I mean, a lot of your allies say hate speech is free speech.
You probably go after people like you because you treat me so unfairly. It's hate. You have a lot of hate in your heart. Maybe they'll come after ABC. Well, ABC paid me $16 million recently for a form of hate speech, right? Your company paid me $16 million for a form of hate speech. So maybe they'll have to go after you.
In the past 48 hours, Trump's inner circle and his allies in right-wing media have been citing the shooting death of conservative activist Charlie Kirk as a justification to crack down not just on the accused perpetrator, but to bring the full weight of the government down on all their perceived enemies and opponents, the left, even though there has been, thankfully, from the actual elected leaders of the Democratic Party, a welcome, universal, and unanimous condemnation of the murder and of all political violence. Even though researchers with no political axe to grind have, when they have looked into the question, consistently found that most American domestic extremist violence is statistically right-wing violence. The New York Times reports President Trump and his top advisors threatened on Monday to unleash the power of the federal government to punish what they allege was a left-wing network that funds and incites violence, seizing on Charlie Kirk's killing to make broad and unsubstantiated claims about their political opponents. That is the plan, plain as day. In fact, they announced it on a special episode of The Charlie Kirk Show, hosted by Vice President J.D. Vance.
We are going to channel all of the anger that we have over the organized campaign that led to this assassination to uproot and dismantle these terrorist networks. So it is a vast domestic terror movement. And with God as my witness, we are going to use every resource we have at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and throughout this government to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these networks and make America safe again for the American people.
Terrorist networks, there is no left-wing terror movement. And certainly there's zero evidence whatsoever that any left-wing terror movement was involved in this murder. And in the complete absence of any evidence of any vast plots, Vance instead singled out an opinion column published by The Nation that criticized Kirk's cultural legacy while also condemning the violence that killed him. It was then the Vice President of the United States called for a war on the free press and its supporters in rhetoric that echoed anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
And there is no unity with the people who fund these articles, who pay the salaries of these terrorist sympathizers. Did you know that the George Soros Open Society Foundation and the Ford Foundation, the groups who funded that disgusting article justifying Charlie's death, do you know they benefit from generous tax treatment? They are literally subsidized by you and me, the American taxpayer. And how do they reward us? by setting fire to the house built by the American family over 250 years.
Those words echo a lot of what Viktor Orban in Hungary has said as he has gone after George Soros and independent institutions of civil society. I mean, that's the vice president of the United States grossly mischaracterizing an article he seemed not to read, spinning it into part of a vast and false Soros conspiracy, saying there's no unity with the other side. But it's not just Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. I mean, the top law enforcement official in the country, Attorney General Pam Bondi, is out there talking about putting cuffs on people whose speech she finds offensive.
Do you see more law enforcement going after these groups who are using hate speech and putting cuffs on people so we show them that some action is better than no action?
We will absolutely target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech.
I mean, again, we're talking about speech here, right? I mean, even the most odious examples are speech, and the stuff they're going after tends to be stuff that is criticizing the person who was very, very tragically slain. Now, that is all what is happening on the higher frequencies. On the lower frequencies, there's a kind of general frenzy being whipped up online by MAGA supporters to find and target everyday people who posted things online that conservatives find objectionable to get those ordinary, regular people fired. A campaign that reached an absurd crescendo Monday when Bondi threatened federal legal action against an Office Depot where an employee reportedly refused to make copies of a poster for a Charlie Kirk vigil.
Employers, you have an obligation to get rid of people. You need to look at people who are saying horrible things, and they shouldn't be working with you. Businesses cannot discriminate. If you want to go in and print posters with Charlie's pictures on them for a vigil, you have to let them do that. We can prosecute you for that. I have Harmeet Dillon right now in our civil rights unit looking at that immediately, that Office Depot had done that.
The overreach here becoming so obvious and absurd, even some far-right conservatives are uneasy with the implications. Right-wing personality Matt Walsh posting today, "Get rid of her." Today, "This is insane. Conservatives have fought for decades," he's right, "for the right to refuse service to anyone. We won that fight. Now Pam Bondi wants to roll it all back for no reason." Of course, Bondi still has her job, unlike a growing list of columnists and professors, teachers, medical professionals, even store clerks and football coaches who have been fired or bullied or threatened for their posts in the past week. Posts that sometimes are just quoting things that Charlie Kirk, a public figure, a very unabashed, a proud activist, said in his life in the course of his work. Keep in mind, all this pressure to speak and act the right way comes from the same political movement that attempted a, violent insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. An anti-democratic coup in which at least 174 law enforcement officials were assaulted. One ultimately died. And it's hard to recall now, but absolutely critical to remember that even the most loyal supporters of Donald Trump knew at the time what January 6th was, and they also took pains to distinguish between nonviolent protesters who showed up at the Capitol that day and the violent folks who actually assaulted cops.
Look, if you protested peacefully on January the 6th and you've had Merrick Garland's Department of Justice treat you like a gang member, you should be pardoned. If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned.
That was J.D. Vance this year, this calendar year. Now, of course, he has changed his tune when Trump pardoned all the insurrectionists, even the violent ones, on his first day in office. The first signal he sent to the American people about his feelings about political violence was approval and encouragement. And now Trump and Vance and the rest of the administration sense this moment as an opportunity in which they can quash dissent and the freedoms that we cherish. Michael Fanone is a former Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police officer who was brutally attacked while defending the Capitol on January 6th. He's now a spokesman, advisory board member, Home of the Brave, an organization highlighting the harms of Trump's second term. Congressman Greg Casar is a Democrat of Texas and chair of the Progressive Caucus, and they join me now. Michael, I immediately thought of you when I saw among the things that J.D. Vance said was, he said, look, there is no both sides issue here. The left supports political violence more than the right does. That's just a fact. And again, this could get into a sort of perverse kind of accounting that's in some ways impossible. There's hundreds of millions of people in America, all of whom have access to social media and can say whatever. But when you're talking about political leadership, I thought of you because you were on the receiving end of political violence. You know how toxic, insidious, and dangerous it is. And the people that did that to you were pardoned by the president. So what do you think?
I'll tell you what I think. I think that no American politician has done more to normalize political violence in this country other than Donald J. Trump. He has used insightful language, dehumanizing language to describe his dissenters or his political opponents. And I would argue that in pardoning at least the 530 some odd insurrectionists who violently assaulted police officers on January 6, 2021, he is advocating for the use of political violence in furtherance of his administration. He has told his supporters that if you commit acts of violence, I've got your back. And this administration will absolve you of any criminal culpability. And that message has resonated with his supporters.
Congressman, those comments by Pam Bondi today and J.D. Vance and others, particularly Pam Bondi, I've seen them sort of reverberate around the Capitol. And I've seen some mixed reaction. And there's been some reporting in the New York Times and Semaphore of Republicans saying, well, wait a second. Maybe we're not on board with this. What is your reaction to the words coming from Bondi, Miller, and Vance, and how seriously to take this as essentially a concerted effort to suppress political dissent, normal political speech?
Look, Donald Trump said very early on that he wants to go after his political opponents, crush free speech, and use the full power of the state to try to stop those people that criticize him. And so in this moment where political violence is on the rise, and this is very serious, instead of actually trying to quell political violence, you see Donald Trump sending out Bondi and Vance to start going after magazines, independent press, independent foundations. Instead of actually trying to address the crisis of political violence, they're trying to weaponize this crisis in order to crush free speech. And as we've seen throughout all of Trump's first term, when people say, no, he doesn't really mean that, that's not really going to happen, we see that they go ahead and do it and do even worse than we imagined. So we have to take this very seriously and make sure that the American people know about and hear about these attacks on free speech, because it's telling that Vance and others are trying to lie about what they're trying to do, because the vast majority of the American people do not support the full weight of the state being used to crush people's peaceful free speech.
Amid the problems facing the country today, President Trump filed a new lawsuit against the New York Times for articles in a book that he thinks was unfairly negative towards him. He claims there were deliberate falsehoods about him and that also they did not note his successes. As a company, the New York Times is worth about $9 billion. Trump's lawyers claim to be seeking the made-up number of $15 billion. That is, for context, larger than the largest libel ruling ever. But if they did win that number, it would bankrupt the whole company. The Times' own account of this very case says the lawsuit is basically against articles that questioned his success. The company says the lawsuit has no merit or any legitimate legal claims. They view it as a way to stifle independent reporting, and they will not be deterred by intimidation tactics. For context, the New York Times is a company that has faced many such cases of varying merit. They know how to defend themselves in court. Interestingly, their publisher was speaking just last night, moments before this suit was filed.
When journalists are kept from providing independent information to the public, it becomes far easier for those in power to act with impunity. If the free press is a watchdog, the playbook seeks to make it a lapdog.
Other media outlets have famously settled even relatively thin lawsuits from Trump, like ABC or CBS. The parent company there was doing a merger and cut a deal, as did some of the other companies you see on your screen, others fighting back. This comes amidst a wider effort to weaponize and do a crackdown. So you have that about liberal groups and other critics. You have the free speech debate we just covered earlier in the broadcast tonight, where the DOJ is actually slightly backing down. And then you have the offense on the civil side of new cases, according to the Times, designed to silence their reporting when the sitting president might have bigger, more important priorities than litigating old feuds about political coverage from past years. We turn to someone else who also cares about the First Amendment and its freedoms. Marty Baron is a veteran journalist. He was the top executive editor of the Washington Post from 2013 to 2021. And we called on him with this big development today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Your thoughts on this incumbent president suing the New York Times over older articles and a book which he views as not positive enough?
Well, it's troubling and alarming. I mean, this is part of an ongoing campaign by Trump to really crush a free and independent press. And in that way, it's deeply concerning, although not really surprising. At the same time, I found the lawsuit I actually got a pretty good laugh out of it because some of the claims there and some of the things that he says about himself are pretty hilarious. I've never read a lawsuit that's quite as self-aggrandizing as this one is. I mean, some of the statements he makes about himself are really extraordinary. So much so that one can imagine that somebody who thinks that stuff about himself would imagine that anything that isn't flattering, anything that isn't fawning, anything that isn't unctuous would be considered defamation. So, but in the bigger picture, it's obviously very concerning. And I think that he really, I don't even think he really cares whether he wins these lawsuits. He just wants to harass the New York Times, and he wants to harass and threaten other major media outlets.
It's well documented this year that some entities, including colleges, have tried to swiftly bend the knee or appease. The Times and the Post, which you ran, have experience with this. There are other powerful people where you've overseen coverage, and they threaten, they send letters, they sometimes sue. Can you walk us through whether that's a differentiator, your view of the Times as an entity that has experience here? We just showed one of its litigators, and can fight back over the long haul.
Well, look, I mean, I think the Times is in a very advantageous position in that it is entirely independent. The owners of the Times have no other commercial interest. They're not dependent upon the federal government for anything. And of course, they have a long history based on principle of standing up for their First Amendment rights. One of the things that A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, said last night, and I was there watching that speech, he talked about the need for publishers and for owners to defend their journalism, to defend their journalists, and to stand up for their rights. And I agree with him entirely.
As you know, there's a bit of a binary or black and white thinking that we have. There are people on the right and allied with Trump who feel and say that the effort to call them the worst of the worst, always a would-be dictator, is unfair to their wider set of political positions. And I think we can understand that. And they're not exactly executing journalists in the street, which is a horror that we've seen along with other dissidents and those targeted in other countries and regimes around the world. We know about that. On the other hand, Sulzberger, who you just cited, who oversees the Times, had a rather detailed look at the other anti-First Amendment acts, which may not be as bad as that violence at a time when we're talking about violence, but are designed to fundamentally and unlawfully constrain the free press. I want to read from this piece, which was last fall, 24, saying that because Trump's country is still a democracy, he can't simply close newspapers or imprison journalists. He sets about undermining independent news organizations in subtler ways, bureaucratic tools such as tax law, broadcast licensing, government contracting, a short version of how Orban effectively dismantled the news media in his country. If Trump follows through on promises, his efforts would be informed by his, quote, open admiration for authoritarians as Orban. How do you view that?
Well, I do think that Trump is following the playbook of authoritarians in other countries, particularly Viktor Orban of Hungary. If you look at what Orban has done in Hungary, Trump seems to be doing exactly the same sorts of things, trying to apply pressure in every conceivable way against an independent press. He views that anything that might contradict him or his story about himself as being defamatory, as being fake news. And he's going to bring pressure in any way that he can, use the entire power of the federal government against media outlets. That is what he's done. He brings these baseless lawsuits where, of course, as president of the United States, he has extra power to apply to some other media organizations, which he has done against CBS, for example, and others. He and ABC as well. He launches investigations, really malicious investigations. And of course, he engages in really vilification because he's got this incredible public forum, and it's really sadistic vilification. He uses some of the harshest language of anybody in the political arena. I mean, I don't think that kind of harsh language is appropriate for the president. I don't think it's really appropriate for anybody, but he's the biggest offender out there, and so is the vice president. And by the way, the vice president at one time described Trump in very harsh language, the very kind of language that he now deplores. He said that Trump could be the next Hitler. He said that he was an idiot. He said he was entirely unfit to be the president of the United States, to hold the nation's highest office. All of the things that Trump is complaining about about a New York Times editorial in this lawsuit are things that J.D. Vance himself has said.
And that's an interesting comparison there. I also want to ask you how, with your journalism experience, it is best to cover what are efforts to normalize and degrade the sort of generally understood baseline of democracy. Because we had an insurrection, he pardoned the people. That was a huge shift that hasn't really been reckoned with. They openly muse in Trump's political operation about seizing power in a third term, which is obviously unconstitutional, and that involves some version of destroying the Constitution or enforcing that through a coup. And we had one of the architects of what they call the sweep from 2020, which failed to override Trump's loss, on the program last night. And we went back and forth about this third term talk, which Trump has gone back and forth on as well. Take a look. Would you rule out joining any effort to pursue an illegal third term for Donald Trump?
Would I rule out?
Yeah, because you were involved in 20.
I don't do this stuff. Look, Ari, the only thing
is
that happened...
No? Was that a no? Would you rule that out in 28?
Come on, you're getting trolled.
If I'm getting trolled, why can't you tell me no?
I haven't done anything illegal. I went to prison for 4 months and didn't do anything illegal.
And a third term is illegal, so you wouldn't support a third term.
You answered your own question. As the boss says, let's see what happens.
Let's see, as an open door to seizing power, is not something we've heard from any other modern administration. What do you think is the right way for both the press and the citizenry to confront this without alarm, but also without normalizing this as some sort of choice, which it isn't?
Well, I think it's very important that the press explains just how extraordinary this is and how out of the norm it is and how unconstitutional it is and how anti-democratic it all is. That's something different than just throwing labels at people and that kind of thing. So I think it's really important that we explain just how different this is, how he's following the playbook of authoritarians around the world, for whom he has openly expressed admiration, and explain why this is really dangerous. And so those are the kinds of things that I think the press really ought to be doing, is laying out those facts, because they are the facts, because the kinds of measures that he has talked about and that he is implementing, in fact, are anti-democratic, are contrary to constitutional precedent. And he's pushing the limits as far as he possibly can. And I imagine that he wants to go even farther. This New York Times this lawsuit against the New York Times is further evidence of that, is that he plans to bring lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit against the press, whether he wins those lawsuits or not. He brought a lawsuit back in 2009 against Tim O'Brien, who was a reporter for the New York Times, because of a book that Tim wrote questioning Trump's wealth, and he lost that lawsuit in 2011. And he said he didn't care that he had lost it because it cost Tim O'Brien money, cost him energy, and created aggravation for him. And so he was delighted, regardless of whether he won or whether he lost. And that's what he intends to do with a lot of media outlets is try to just make their lives miserable and cost them a lot of money. And so these lawsuits are expensive. And by the way, where they file the lawsuit, that happens to be in that federal court district, that happens to be a place where Trump has appointed a lot of federal judges. So he judge shops all the time, of course, and he likes to file his lawsuits in Florida.